Hi again. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the American West. And I want to talk to you about the reasons the different people were populating the West. They're really displacing the Native Americans that were already there, but a really big, diverse group of people, about half whites, the other half Hispanics and Black Americans, a lot of Chinese immigrants and such. So again, a very diverse group of people that are going to be populating the West, again, displacing the native people who are already there. But I want to talk about why. Why in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, are so many people moving to the West, migrating to the West. And there's a number of reasons, and I want to try to hit these with you. Your textbook talks about these. I want to flesh it out a little bit more for you. One of the big reasons was mining. So think about this. Think about if you follow NFL football at all, who's the San Francisco football team? The 49ers, right? The San Francisco 49ers. And who are they named for? Can you think back to your time in high school or just general history? The gold rush, right? That's what we're thinking about, that idea of the gold rush. The 49ers in 1849 is when gold was discovered out in California. And so you have this huge influx of people who all think they're going to get rich. And there's all sorts of movies that have the the panhandler that's trying to pan for gold and that sort of thing. This was a big reason that thousands of people moved to the West in the hopes of getting rich quick. You have gold that's discovered, silver as well. And those great years of the gold rush that we think about are really the 1860s and 1870s. Much beyond that, the gold and silver is pretty gone by the 1880s, but people still go. Your book talks about that commercialization of industry, even in the West. And that's one of the things that happens with mining as well, is you have this idea of, while the image of the West and the myth of the West is, the individual gold miner going out there, standing in the water, trying to shake his pan for his gold, when in reality, it very quickly turns into commercial mining. And I'll have some pictures for you in the little PowerPoint that I do later, but this idea of big industrial machines coming in and mining for zinc, mining for ore, big hydraulic mining that's going to be going on. And while we're going to talk about industrialization next week, these two go together, right? The population of the West and the expansion in the West wouldn't have occurred without the industrialization in the East. And the industrialization in the East couldn't have happened without the population and the domination of the West. So we'll talk about that more next week, but keep that in mind, how these two are very interconnected. Okay. So mining was one of the pieces. The second piece was vast immigration. So we've got vast immigration that's going to occur in the West in this time period. Of course, Native Americans have always been there in the American West. Hispanics and people from Mexico have been in the West for forever as well, right? For many centuries, and dominated that whole western portion of the United States for centuries before the United States took it from Mexico, right? Fought and took it. So you have the Pueblo Indians, you have descendants of the Spanish and others that are there. But you have a lot of Hispanics that are going to move into the region that hadn't been there before. And then you have families who've been there for generations. And your textbook talks about the sheep farmers and others who had these big, vast plats of land and had been there for a long time, and how the white settlers come in and displace them from their land and from their family homes, pushing them to be working class and seasonal workers. Another really important group of immigrants that we're going to talk about more in the next talks are the Chinese, and they are really important to settling the West and doing the labor of the West. Some come in the 1850s, 60s, all the way through the 1870s. often borrowing money for their passage. So once they get to the United States, they have to work off their debt, and not a good experience for most of them. And they're very important laborers on the railroad, which again we'll talk about a little bit more. But the railroad wouldn't have been built. Certainly, the Transcontinental Railroad wouldn't have been built without Chinese immigrants doing much of the Western labor. Uh, we will talk about the Chinese more next week and the week after, but it's important to recognize there was a lot of discrimination against those Chinese immigrants, and undercutting of their uh, labor and things like that with low wages because of racial discrimination. And you have a lot of conflict because of just that bias against the Chinese. Uh, it reaches the point where in 1882 you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we'll talk about this more again later on. But it's really important to recognize the United States. There were whites in the West, particularly in California, who saw the Chinese as competition for jobs, didn't like them, were racist against them, and went to Congress in part, got California made a state, and got this law passed against the Chinese to exclude the Chinese so they could no longer immigrate, and even the Chinese who were in the United States could no longer be a citizen. So it was really very discriminatory law, but we'll talk about that more later. Okay. Another really important force in populating the West was the railroad. And again, we'll talk about this more extensively next week, but the railroad is super important to the expansion of the West. The final spike was driven in that transcontinental railroad that went all the way across the United States in 1869. So all of a sudden, the goods that are produced, or the iron ore or whatever that is found in the West, can be shipped to the factories in the East. Those factories in the East can ship finished goods to the West. It really opens up the possibilities for trade in the United States in very extensive ways. We'll talk next class, or next week, more about the idea that the government helped pay for this and what they did to Native Americans to get it. But the railroad was a huge part of this. Right. Something else that your textbook talks about is the ranching or ranging. Out here in Texas, sometimes we sing, "Oh, home on the range," right? I don't, but people do, right? This idea of the vast swaths of land that are owned by one family. And if you ever drive west out 380 or go out towards Abilene, you drive and drive and drive at 80 miles an hour, and all the fence is the same. It's because it's all one big ranch, right? And it's just amazing to think about. But that idea of the cattle drive, and that fitting in that mythology of the United States. Again, your textbook talks about this idea that, again, most of the cowboys that were on those cattle drives were very diverse, some white, some black, some Hispanic. Many of the images that we think of the cowboy came from Mexico, right? The hat, the boots, the chaps, all of that comes from Mexico. And this idea of these cattle drives, to drive thousands of head of cattle up from where they'd been raised to the rail lines to get to the eastern markets and be sold at great profit. And it works for a while, but it's not a very glamorous life if you have that part of your mythology of the West. One of the documents I included in Canvas was a call for a strike, a contract negotiation, if you will, from some cowboys in this time period. And look at the pay they're making. It's very low wages, very hard labor, and it's not very romantic, right? And then another piece, and that ranching and ranging, this idea of the cattle drives really goes away once the railroads get extended. And I'll have some maps for you about the railroad to show that to you as well. And then a big part of the expansion of the West, the populating of the West, growing those numbers, is farming. Right? Right. Farming. Now, I grew up in Nebraska. I grew up in Omaha, and so this is really what I imagined the West. It was a lot of family farms. My people came from Sweden and were farmers in middle Nebraska, had just small plots. And this filling in of land where Native Americans had lived, and for centuries, everything really changes in 1862. That Homestead Act of 1862. That's a really important piece for you to understand. And we'll see it again. It's one of those things that, if you remember our discussion of Reconstruction, they talked about giving former slaves 160 acres. This is where that came from. That idea of what the Homestead Act is the federal government would give 160 acres of public land. Right? Now, this is land that Native Americans had been using for centuries, obviously, but land that was not privately owned, but that the federal government had taken over and dominated and claimed as public land. So the Homestead Act said that the federal government would give an individual head of a household 160 acres of land for free for 5 years, right? So if you live on this land for 5 years and you improve it, you grow crops on it, you build a home on it, you make improvements on the land, and you stay there for the 5 years, then the deed goes to you. Then it becomes your land. Now think about this for these, hundreds of thousands of poor immigrants from Europe or anywhere else in the world, and this idea of free land when there is no land, right? All you want to do is farm. And the opportunity to have free land and to have a home for your family. This is a huge thing, and it changes everything. You get a lot of immigrants, and we talk about this. I'm sure you learned this in middle school or grade school about German immigrants coming to Texas. But again, my family were Swedish immigrants that came to the middle of Nebraska and had their 160-acre plot and farmed. There's still a Dahlgren family farm up in Nebraska. The challenge is you have that story of, this was a great opportunity for these immigrants, including my family. But then you think about, who did they displace, right? Who was there before? Whose land did they put their house on? And of course, that is the Native Americans who were already there. So the story of America is complicated because, on one side, it's this great land of opportunity. And on the other, there were people already there who, what happened to their opportunity and their lifestyle? So it's that figuring out how to bring those two realities together, that something like my family found opportunity there, but they took the land from someone else, maybe unwittingly, but they did it all the same, right? The growth of people in this region, mainly the Midwestern states that I'm thinking about here, that middle states, Minnesota, the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, that region of the middle part of the United States, the population grew from about 300,000. And again, these are people that the federal government is counting, right? This isn't going to be Native Americans that they're counting, but 300,000 in 1860 to over 5 million people in 1900. So a huge leap in population in this time period. And the reality is, the way they were able to farm this land, if you've ever been much west of here, the trees kind of go away. If you've driven through Kansas or Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, there's not a lot of trees. So, how do you build a fence around your field? How do you build your house? And they used different things. They used new technology to build to farm. Steel was now being made cheaply, so they have barbed wire, which is one of the most important inventions ever, and steel plows, which is going to help a lot as well. They made sod houses. I'll have a picture of a sod house for you, where they dug up the dirt and the sod and laid it like bricks to build a home. It was a very harsh and lonely life as well. Um, I like to share the story of my family. So my great grandmother, her mother was born in Sweden, came to the United States when she was 17, and married another Swedish immigrant, and lived out in the wilds of Nebraska on a little farm. He had to go into town for something, and she went into labor with their first child. This was December in Nebraska in a sod house, and she delivered her first child in that sod house by herself when she was 18, 19 years old. The neighbors that night realized there was no smoke coming out of her chimney and went and checked on her, and were able to stoke the fire and help her. But my great grandmother survived because my great great grandmother was, I don't know, quite tough, I guess. but it was a very lonely, very empty space. And for many immigrants, and this is across generations until we've reached really our modern times, once you leave, you don't speak to that family again, the people you left behind. You're on your own, and it's a very serious thing. So all of these things come together to populate the West and to dramatically change what the West looks like and how many people are there and what they're doing. So think about your reading and things like that. And I just wanted to go through these pretty basic ideas of populating the West. And we'll talk about Native Americans in the next little micro lecture. Thanks.